Bienvenidos asistentes a un día más de la Semana Internacional de los Drones en Agricultura de Precisión, Silvicultura 4.0 y Medio Ambiente. El día de hoy vamos a empezar con una ponencia en inglés por el doctor Jan van Aardt. Jan van Aardt obtuvo una licenciatura en Ciencias Forestales, especialización en Biometría y Silvicultura de la Universidad de Stellenbosch, Sudáfrica. Esto le siguió un licenciado en Silvicultura, especialización en Sistemas de Información Geográfica y Teledetección, también de la Universidad de Stellenbosch. Jan luego completó el MS y PhD, títulos forestales en el Instituto Politécnico de Virginia y la Universidad Estatal de Blacksburg, Virginia. Estos títulos se centraron respectivamente en aplicaciones de espectroscopía de imagen hiperespectral y detección de luz y rango LiDAR en la silvicultura. La detección hiperespectral, LiDAR y multitemporal forman el núcleo de sus esfuerzos con varios proyectos forestales y de ecosistemas, por ejemplo, calidad de la tierra y cambio global. Bienvenido, Dr. Jan van Aardt. Welcome, Dr. Jan van Aardt. You can start your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I understood some of what you said here and there. I speak Afrikaans at home, that's my mother tongue, but unfortunately I'm not fluent in Spanish yet anyway. My daughter can speak some Spanish, but I need to learn, I reckon. So it's really a privilege for me to be here this morning and to talk to you about drone usage in especially crop management. You'll see that we are focusing on three main topics, and that is growth stage classification. In other words, what stage the crop is at, when to harvest the crop, also yield forecasting, and then finally the big difficult one is disease risk assessment. Can we detect or predict disease in crops? And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors very early. Both Amir and Faye are PhD students, and then Drs. Kickert and Petherbridge are plant pathologists at Cornell University, and we work very closely with Cornell, us in imaging science and them in plant pathology. And I'm just going to take a quick time out and just tell you a little bit about imaging science at Rochester Institute of Technology. You can see the webpage there. But in essence, we work with everything that has to do with the camera. As an example, the camera on your cell phones, from the photons as they propagate through the optics onto the detector plane, the image formation, and then the analysis of that imagery to extract information. So I work more on the applied side, but I have colleagues who work on detectors, optics, algorithms, etc. And I'm part of a smaller group within imaging science called digital imaging and remote sensing. So we work obviously with a lot of remote sensing type science and so on. So I just wanted to mention that briefly. So I'm not going to cover everything that I've written here, but I think that the key thing that I want to convey is increasingly we're working on what's called precision agriculture. So a farmer used to manage at the field level, apply fertilizer at the field level, but increasingly farmers want to have more spatially explicit management. In other words, detect zones in a field that needs different management strategies than other zones. And the other important thing is, I don't care if you talk to farmers in New York or in Peru, and probably in Mexico as well. I visited Peru last year, and I did not want to ask them, or I did not want to tell them about the research we're doing. I wanted to ask about their problems, their challenges. And without a doubt, farmers in New York and farmers in Peru have the same three challenges. Yield forecasting. They want to know how much yield they can expect for logistic purposes, harvesting purposes, or for intervening and improving the yield. Disease detection, that's the difficult one. Can they apply fungicides, pesticides more strategically and not for the whole field? And then the interesting one to me, harvest scheduling, when to harvest so that you have optimized yield. And that's something I always thought that farmers knew. I grew up on a farm, but for some of these crops, there's a very specific time period when you want to harvest to make sure that you get optimal yield. And I hope I'm not preaching to the choir here. It's just part of the introduction, but I just wanted to talk about the beauty of physics and biology, right? When you look at vegetation and its electromagnetic radiation, its reflectance. And I think a lot of you as students and as audience members probably know what I'm about to show you, but I'm going to do it just to get us all on the same page. This is actually a scene from the Kruger National Park in South Africa. It was taken with an imaging spectrometer, a hyperspectral scene, and obviously you're looking at the scene in true color. But if I look at that scene in near-infrared displayed as red, red displayed as green, and green energy displayed as blue, you've probably seen this kind of false color composite. And suddenly all the vegetation appears red because red represents near-infrared reflectance. We as humans only see in this range, blue, green, and red. You see the absorption in blue and red due to photosynthesis. You see this very steep increase, the red edge, and then the high near-infrared plateau for near-infrared reflectance. And as many of you know, vegetation actually heavily reflects and transmits near-infrared energy. So we can exploit that information to see if vegetation is moisture stressed, nutrient stressed, etc., the condition of the vegetation. And one of the things you should realize is we can collect too much data. And from a spectral sense, I think many of you know what hyperspectral is too, right? But it's narrow, contiguous, right next to each other wavelengths. And instead of just sampling a blue and a green and a red wavelength, for instance, we're sampling many different greens, many different reds, many different near-infrareds, so that I can literally oversample an image. And if you plot that on a snap beam, so this is a beam field down by Cornell's research station, and you extract pixel level spectra, this is what you'd see. Because you're extracting a hyperspectral signal, you're looking at reflectance by wavelength, you get very detailed curves. And here you see the very typical vegetation spectral reflectance curve for a bunch of different bean plants. Again, you see absorption in the blue area and the red area for photosynthesis, a little bit of reflectance in the green. That's why plants are green to us with our naked eye. But then there's heavy reflectance in the near-infrared. But the key is we're sampling too much data. And we're sampling too much data to determine exactly what we need for a specific application. Here's just another representation of a hyperspectral cube, as we call it, an image cube, where I have my X and my Y dimension of that field. And in the Z dimension, the third dimension, I've got wavelength. And here wavelength doesn't represent color, it represents intensity by color. So you start off with the blues, through the greens, through the red, and high near-infrared, high intensity near-infrared for the plants on the scene. So you get a lot of spectral information. And I think that's the critical thing to realize here. I'm oversampling the problem. But we can always also oversample, not in the color domain, but also in the structural domain. And many of you are familiar with LiDAR, right? This very fast pulsing laser, typically from an airplane, can also be terrestrial based. And I measure the return trip distance for each of these scans, so I get a 3D point cloud, such as this one for a vineyard. Now, again, I have so much structural information so that I can determine exactly what I need for specific applications. Here is an example of our snap bean field in Ithaca, New York, by Cornell's research station. You're looking at snap beans and planted obviously in a row setup. And here you're seeing a LiDAR point cloud for that same field. And there's a lot of information I can extract. I'll give you one example. If you look at these point clouds and you facetize them, in other words, you just literally connect the three closest 3D points iteratively, you get a facetized 3D model on a per plant basis. Now, if you calculate the normals, so the normal angles to each facet as it goes across the canopy, you're probably going to get a very interesting distribution for a canopy closed, healthy plant. Now think about a plant that might be diseased or young, so it has a lot of open gaps. All the facets are going to be pointing in different directions, so the normal angles are going to look very different. We can use metrics like this to indicate whether a plant is closed canopy or open canopy. And a closed canopy plant is very much subject or more at risk for mold, one of the key diseases in snap beans. So if we can show structurally that a plant is intact, we can show maybe it has a high risk for mold versus a plant that's less intact and wind can blow through and keep mold away from taking hold in the plant. Why do we fly? I think a lot of people these days fly drones, right? And it's easy to boast, to brag about the drones. And I'm not bragging because I'm not the drone pilot, and I also don't supervise the drone engineering program here at RIT. But I think arguably RIT has one of the best setups in terms of drone capabilities. We fly the whole range of sensors you can almost imagine, from hyperspectral head-wall nano, and not only the visible near-infrared, but also the shortwave infrared sensors, through long-wave, in other words, thermal cameras, uncooled, so it just shows you hot and cold pixels. We now even have a calibrated thermal camera, so it shows you absolute temperature and 0.1 Kelvin specificity. We also are flying a LiDAR, light detection and ranging sensor, and then very typical Mica sense, so 5-band silicon camera, so you get 5 specific wavelengths. And what I'm not showing here is the shortwave infrared camera that we're flying. It's also head-wall photonics shortwave infrared sensor. And then the newest addition to the platform is actually a Ku-band SAR, synthetic aperture radar. So it's a very, very exciting sensor platform flown across multiple drones like these, typical DJI Matrix 600s or the DJI Winds and so on. What's very important, this is a research platform. It flies slow and it flies low. When I show a farmer this drone, he gets very excited because it's sexy, you know, it's a cool drone. But I see them lose interest very quickly when they see how slow it flies for research purposes, because we have to integrate enough energy from the target so that we get high signal to noise in our cameras. This camera, however, the red one, the Mica Sense, I can mount on a much cheaper drone and fly much faster. And as soon as I fly them, let's think of it as a less sexy drone, right? A small, fast-flying drone with only one sensor. Suddenly, the farmers are really interested because they see the practical use of the drone. I can cover 100 hectares maybe in an hour, instead of this drone that can cover 5 hectares in an hour. So it's not a very practical solution, it's a research solution. So that's why I call this the Goldilocks principle. We go from a very expensive platform. Our most expensive drone, if you mount the shortwave infrared camera and the thermal camera, for instance, it tops out at about $250,000 US. It's very expensive. But no farmer wants to fly a $250,000 drone. We just do it for research to determine exactly which wavelengths and which structural information we need for a specific application. We very much take the philosophy of going from this expensive research drone to the cheap operational drone that is specific and tailored for a specific application like nitrogen assessment, moisture assessment. So that's the idea, is to go from too much to just right. And here's just an example of, again, that curve, that typical reflectance curve, where we can extract specific wavelengths in specific indexes. So we can take the photochemical reflectance index, which was made famous by John Gammon, and you can see that you use a wavelength of roughly 530 and 570, you ratio those two, and they give you good information about photosynthetic efficiency of a plant. So you just need those 2 wavelengths to determine photosynthetic efficiency of a plant. But you would have never have known that had you not sampled the entire spectrum. And that's the philosophy that we do here. So hopefully that introduction made sense. I'm going to shift gears now a little bit, and I'm going to talk about Amir's PhD work that's ongoing. He's working as we speak on the research, and he's specifically looking at the spectral approach to yield forecasting and growth stage classification. So he's using hyperspectral imagery to do these 2 things. And we work on snap beans as a proxy crop. It's just an example crop to show that the technology and the algorithms can work. And by extension, we can then look at other crops like beets, corn, you name it. So the need for this kind of yield management and yield prediction is obvious. You know, we have huge population growth in global terms. And years you just see a projection of around 2100, we're looking at almost 11 billion people. And there's an obvious need to feed so many mouths. And not only to feed so many mouths, but to do so from less ground, less area, more marginal areas for agriculture. We might have climate change occurring, so we need to adapt our strategy. So there's a real need to grow more with less. And that's where drones come into play. There's a lot of people doing research on this. RIT and Cornell as a team, we're not the only. I'm very sure there are researchers at your own institutions that are working very hard on this. I just give you two quick examples from either colleagues or friends or collaborators of mine. One is Dr. Sorin Popescu at Texas A&M University. Sorin and his team are working on using LiDAR and structure from motion. So just quickly, structure from motion, stereoscopic imagery. So I fly high overlapping imagery, and from the overlapping area, I can extract a 3D visualization or 3D information. I always use this example with my students. My wife has a Subaru, and in front of the rear view mirror, there's two cameras facing forward. And these two cameras are literally collecting overlapping imagery from the road in front of the vehicle. And because it has an algorithm embedded in the car's computer system, it can actually measure the distance from the car to the next car. So you can drive along the highway, and you can say you want to drive 120 kilometers an hour as an example. And you can set the cruise control, and you want to say, maybe I maintain 3 car lengths between the car in front of me. And the vehicle will automatically just adjust the distance and the speed of your vehicle to maintain 3 car lengths, just based on that overlapping imagery. And that's the same principle here with structure from motion. Same reason you and I have 2 eyes, right? So we can see 3D. So Sorin and his team are using LiDAR data as well as structure from motion, which is much cheaper to collect than LiDAR data, to look at sorghum and panicles and to identify the larger panicles for breeding purposes and harvesting purposes. On the right here, you see what I think is one of the most exciting research that I've heard in a long time. This is not mine, it's from Dr. Abe Strook at Cornell University. He is in the engineering department, and what he's working on is pressure injecting nanoparticles into leaves. So they literally pressure inject nanoparticles into the leaf structure. And here's the neat thing. These nanoparticles fluoresce, they emit energy as a function of water stress. Think about that for a second. You have nanoparticles inside the leaf that is emitting a signal based on how thirsty or water stressed the plant is. So now you have a big crop sprayer, and instead of spraying the entire field equally, you can potentially assess the signal of thirst from the plant and adjust your irrigation mechanism. Now in upstate New York, we have a lot of water, but I'm from South Africa. It's a pretty arid country. I think Mexico is similar. You have a lot of need for water management. And this is a type of technology that I think is very exciting in this precision agriculture. So back to Amir's work. So we work with drones a lot, but we often start our research in the lab or in a greenhouse first, sort of the best case scenario. So what Amir did is he planted a bunch of beans in a greenhouse, and he had this measurement tool. It's an ASD spectrodiometer, actually SVC, and he provided his own light source. He maintained external light. He actually had a drape around the measurement area so that you don't have any external light. You absolutely get the base signal. You can see the plant here even has a drape across the soil so that we only get plant signal. And he measured these plants on a daily basis for the whole growing season to see if we can spectrally predict yield as well as classify growth stage. Here's just an example of the different growth stages: budding, flowering, pod formation. And you might say, why is it important to classify growth stage? A farmer can walk in the field and see whether or not his or her beans are flowering. One of the diseases, white mold, actually enters the beans through the flowers. And these flowers aren't pointing up to the sensor. They're hidden under the canopy. So if we can fly and identify flowering intensity and location, we can potentially indicate where we should spray more or less fungicides. So it's a really cool way to say what condition or what state each plant is in. In terms of harvest scheduling, when they harvest beans or when they measure beans, they have this ruler, you see it here at the bottom right, that a crop scout takes to the field and physically measures the different bean sizes and classifies them according to different sieve sizes. And typically, they want to harvest when the beans are at size 6, you can see the big beans, or 5, but majority 6. They don't want to harvest when the beans are still at this stage. because then you're underutilizing your field and under harvesting. So can we actually classify bean stage using spectral information? Here's just an example of a mere setup that you've seen with that drape over the sensor. And here are some of the spectral information. DAP, days after planting. And here you can see spectral information, just as an example, from visible, near infrared through shortwave infrared for different days after planting. So let's just look at an example. So Amir used a bunch of different approaches, from random forest to perceptron to some deep learning methods to support vector machines. Many of these algorithms you've probably heard about. K-nearest neighbor classification. And here's just an example of classifying budding versus non-budding. So you can identify which plants are now approximating or getting close to flowering stages. And you can see very high accuracy for the top 2 wavelengths, maybe 5 wavelengths or maybe 10 wavelengths. But even with 2 wavelengths only, Amir could achieve 82% accuracy in differentiating between budding and non-budding plants. And if you add 3 more wavelengths, you can actually classify 90% accuracy. Now think about that, 5 wavelengths. And here you see some examples of those wavelengths in nanometers, 691, which is sort of in the red near infrared region, the 2000s are in the shortwave infrared, etc. But if you can potentially program those 5 wavelengths into a camera, you can now accurately predict budding and non-budding. And that's the whole philosophy that I spoke about, where we have too much spectral information to identify what we need. Here's actually another one, sort of a comprehensive summary table of different classes, so different growth stages. You see vegetative growth, budding, flowering, pod formation, and you see the accuracies for pod formation, for instance, at 83% accuracies. Users and producers accuracies with an overall accuracy of roughly 80%. And this is using only 2 wavelengths in a sort of normalized index fashion. So this is very exciting. You can actually potentially use 2 wavelengths. This is just an example of those wavelengths. They might not be the specific wavelengths for every growth stage, but you could potentially use 2 wavelengths to accurately classify growth stage and manage accordingly. Shifting gears a little bit, harvest scheduling, knowing when to harvest. Now, don't get me wrong, the crop scouts go out and they measure the bean sizes in the field, but imagine if you can fly a drone and not only measure the bean sizes or predict the bean sizes, but say where you should harvest tomorrow and where not. You can truly optimize your yield on a per field basis. You can see here that Amir looked at specifically growth stages or pod sizes 5 and 6 versus the rest, 1 through 4. So again, the 2 big pod sizes, and he achieved 80% accuracies. Now, again, the neat thing here is you can have a wall-to-wall estimate of pod sizes for your field. And it was very interesting. We work with industry quite a bit, folks from Seneca Foods and Farm Fresh First, 2 big growers here in upstate New York. And the guy said, this is very cool research, but if I have to fly a drone, I still have to send someone to the field. Can you extend your results to satellites? So I can sit behind my computer in my office and pull satellite data and predict where I should harvest when for my whole entire region. Imagine that technology. And that's the next step, to see if we can scale these results to satellites. Finally, for Amir's work, here you can see some yield forecasting results. You're looking at different pre-processing, raw data, smooth, first derivative, something called continuum removal. And you can actually see very high R-squares or model accuracies, if you will, for predicting yield. Most of them are a little closer to harvest time, we should expect when the plants are more mature, but you get pretty high accuracies for even like 40 days after planting. So that was all for greenhouse. Our next step for Amir's work is to actually extend the work to field data, to actual drone data. The greenhouse experiment Amir did in the winter of last year because we were waiting for the snow to melt. Just to put it in perspective, I'm 1.83 meters tall. So in American language, 6 feet tall. We get about 6 feet of snow every year where I live now. So it's a lot of snow. So you have to make some other plans if you want to do research. You cannot go outside and fly the drone. So Amir was focused on the greenhouse study in wintertime, and now summertime we could collect a lot of drone data We are close to the Finger Lakes area, so you see some of the big lakes in upper New York here, and then the location of the sites here at Cornell's research site at the northern end of Lake Seneca, one of the big Finger Lakes, beautiful big lakes, deep lakes, 200-meter deep, some of these. Here's an example of the image itself. We place a lot of emphasis on calibration. You can see some calibration targets here. We're also using downwelling sensors now for calibration, because otherwise we have to go and revisit each calibration panel after a flight line, visit cal panel, flight line, visit cal panel. You get the idea. But we use that calibration panels to convert from radiance data, which can be heavily influenced by illumination conditions, a cloudy day versus a sunny day, convert that data from radiance data to reflectance data. Now we have data that's consistent through time. If the plant hasn't changed, its reflectance should be the same whether or not it's cloudy or sunny. And that's the principle that we worked on. Here you can see the drone on the ground in this case, with that host of sensors that we flew. We also flew the shortwave infrared sensor. And just to step you through the process, obviously as you fly and collect data, you first want to detect the vegetation. You don't want to perform analysis for ground pixels. You want to remove some of these highly repetitive bands or highly correlated bands. Some of these bands, because they're so closely spaced, 690 nanometers, 695 nanometers, so you get the idea. They're highly correlated. So first you want to identify the bands that are useful for an application or a problem, and then make sure that you don't overfit your problem. You want to decorrelate your data. And then you fit some sort of function that predicts, for instance, yield as a function of hyperspectral data. Here's just very simple vegetation detection. This is not rocket science, but you can use very simple ratios of specific bands to separate the ground pixels from the vegetation pixels. Again, this is not rocket science. Many of you have probably done this in early research projects or class projects even. So, but that's the first step. We first want to make sure that we perform our analysis for the vegetation. And then we look at correlation. You could know all about correlation, but we plot the different bands, we assess the Pearson correlation coefficients, and we throw away the band that has the least amount of predictive ability for a specific model, and continue with the other band that might be correlated to the band we threw away, but it's more predictive. And here's some yield findings from the drones in this case. You can see the R-square for the models are decently high, around 0.8, 0.85, approximately 46 days after planting. So we harvest the beans roughly at 55 days. So it's still a ways to go, but I would have liked to see earlier predictive ability, earlier in the season. But I'm just showing you the truth that we found. And at 46 days after planting, in other words, at roughly 10 days before harvesting, we can tell you what the harvest would be at different locations. Now the good thing is 10 days is still plenty time to put your logistics in place. The mechanisms, the trucks, etc., that needs to work coincidentally with the harvest. Here you can see the root mean square error, and you can again see at 46 days after planting, we have a very low root mean square error, tons per acre, so it's an American acre. There's about, I think, 2.43 acres to the hectare, just to put that in perspective, 2.43 acres to the hectare. But here you can see very low RMSEs. So the models are really accurate, but that's the caveat, only 10 days before harvesting. So we're still working on seeing if we can improve the models for earlier in the season. And this is one of the exciting ones to me. This is using drone data to separate those different pod sizes. Remember pod sizes 1 through 4, the ones I don't want, they're still too young. And then pod sizes 5 and 6, the ones that are really ready for harvest. We're close to 90% accuracy, classifying pod sizes based on spectral data. And think about this, we're not seeing the pods, we're just seeing the canopy. So we can assess the change in physiology of the plant from a drone platform and tell you which plants have mature pods and are ready for harvest. And this to me is one of the most exciting outcomes. But as I said, we still want to extend it to the satellite level. So that's a little bit on yield forecasting and maturity assessment using spectral data. Another PhD student of mine, Fei Zhang, both very good students, they're much smarter than I am, but don't tell them that. He's working more on the structural aspect. So Fei's objectives are to extract structural information from LiDAR and structure from motion, that's stereoscopic imagery, to predict yield. So we want to see, can we use structure to do the yield prediction? And then also to assess disease risk. Remember I said the white mold for snap bean, they want two things. They want flowers, that's where they enter the plant. So if we can detect the flowering, which we can pretty accurately, and they want dense structure. You can think of that dense structure almost as a greenhouse environment, a very humid environment where mold likes to grow. So if they have those two things, you can put a flag on that plant and say high risk, spray fungicide. And if you can see now it's lower intensity flowering, less dense structure, you can assess a lower risk and in other words apply fewer fungicides. Now everybody wins. The farmer wins because he or she actually can save money by not just spraying everything with fungicide, and environment wins because there's not too much fungicide running off into the stream. So what is leaf area index? I just thought I'd introduce this very briefly. It's a very simple concept, but it's something that engineers and imaging scientists, many of my students first have to understand before they can try and estimate it. But it's literally the single-sided projected area of leaf over area ground. And you can see in this right-hand side, if I project these 3 leaves onto area ground, for argument's sake, say the leaves are each 1 square meter over 1 square meter ground. It's in other words 3 square meters divided by 1 square meter ground, and you get a leaf area index of 3. It's a very often used metric in forestry, in crops, to assess leaf density and photosynthetic capture ability for the leaves to capture photons from the sun. So a forest with an LAI of 3 is typically a pretty dense forest, but in the Amazonian forests, you can go as high as 5 and above for leaf area index. So it gives you an idea of leaf and canopy structure. So Faye uses a LAI measurement instrument. It's an LP80 Accupar that you stick under the canopy, and you have another one that logs the available energy. Then you have one that logs the energy underneath the canopy, and the ratio of the two gives you something related to leaf area index. Obviously, we fly the drone with its stereoscopic cameras as well as the LiDAR, so that we can assess both LiDAR structure and structure from motion. Hopefully you can see some of the animation here playing on my screen, but the LiDAR point cloud from the drone is very, very messy. I've worked with LiDAR in forest for a long time, and forests have beautiful LiDAR data. It's very structured, layered, but because these crops are so small, the point clouds are really messy. You get a lot of erroneous signals from the scanning mechanism of the velodyne. It's literally a 16-channel laser that rotates. So you actually get scan upward. So you have to remove those and just focus and crop to the field of interest on the right. Once you've done that, you can remove noisy points, outlier points, duplicate points, etc., so that you're sure that you're working with the actual data from the field. You can see some plates in the field. Faye put some plates in the field so that he can calibrate the LiDAR sensor. He measures their height above the soils, and then he correlates them with what he sees from the data. And then the final step is classifying ground versus non-ground points. In other words, those laser hits that come from the soil and those laser hits that come from vegetation material. You probably know all about this. Some of you have worked with LiDAR, but the idea is that you can then interpolate the ground points into a digital elevation model, and you subtract that digital elevation model from all the points, and then you've height normalized the points. Now the points are not expressed as a range from the drone or above sea level anymore, but they're expressed as height above ground or height above the digital elevation model. Now I can analyze it because I can say that plant is 43 centimeters tall, in other words, above the ground. So that's what I'm showing here, is where you go from a point cloud that's expressed as typically above mean sea level to one that's now expressed as height above ground. So it's each pixel or each point is now expressed as the relative height above the digital elevation model. So here you can see an interpolated digital elevation model of height above ground. You can see that the rows of the snap beans are warmer, so that indicates a taller plant, versus the cool colors are literally ground points or at the ground. Now, this is always tricky with LiDAR. You have this beautiful point cloud. You have so much structural information, but what do you do with it? So what Faye has done is he's tried a bunch of different methods. From Beer-Lambert's law, which is related to gap fraction, so literally the penetration capability of LiDAR into the canopy and to the ground, to other indices like the all-echo cover index, the intensity ratio index, etc., etc. You try and extract some metrics from the LiDAR point cloud that you can plug into a model with which you try and predict yield. Otherwise, what are you extracting? And my research, early PhD research at Virginia Tech, we, for instance, looked at the distribution of heights to estimate forest volume and biomass, etc. And it worked well, but it's a very broad approach to just take distributions and what do you call it, quantiles, etc. So it's much better to look at something like penetration rates. You know, that's something I can wrap my head around. If I say I've got this many LiDAR hits inbound and only this many hit the ground, I have a good idea of how many were intercepted by the canopy. So it gives me an idea of the density of the canopy. Then to switch gears a little bit, this is the 3D point cloud extracted from structure from motion. So this is not active sensing, laser sensing. This is literally the previously mentioned example of the overlapping stereo cameras that you see here. Now, the good thing about structure from motion is it's cheap. You can buy a silly camera from any store, mount it on a drone, and if you fly overlapping imagery, you can extract a 3D point cloud. It really is not that difficult. The algorithms and the software exist, so you can easily extract a 3D point cloud. The catch is LiDAR typically gives you better penetration through the canopy to the ground. So there's a trade-off. LiDAR is expensive, it's high volume data, difficult to process, but it gives you better penetration, denser point cloud. Structure from motion is cheaper, easy to process, but it only gives you a 3D point for every pixel that you can see. So you can imagine your structure from motion point cloud's density depends on the spatial resolution, the pixel size of your images. So it's all good and well if you can fly 1 centimeter pixels, because in theory you can get one 3D point for every overlapping 1 centimeter pixel. But it has a drawback in that sense. Faye did the same here. He actually calculated the Z residual, in other words, the height above ground for these point clouds. And then here you can see an example of that normal features. He actually fits a facet to the point cloud, and then he calculates the normal angle for each facet. And we can use the distribution of those normal angles to tell if a plant canopy is nice and round or if it's scraggly, you know, it's sort of thin. Just as another example, we use the same algorithm to detect damaged buildings during the Haiti earthquake. Some of you might remember that horrible earthquake that occurred in Haiti in 2010. We actually flew some of our LiDAR sensors right after that earthquake happened. And what we did is we did a very similar algorithm. We used a very similar algorithm. We fit facets to the LiDAR point cloud, and a roof that is intact, all its facets will, or its normal angles will look like that on the one side and like that on the other side. It would have very structured normal angles. But a roof that was sort of damaged and all fallen into onto itself would have normal angles pointing all over the place. So you can actually assess damaged versus intact buildings using this kind of algorithm. So then Faye could also remember, I should back up, this structure for motion point cloud was extracted from a frame camera, specifically the MicaSense camera with 5 spectral channels. So this is an interesting angle to the whole structural analysis. He could extract structure for motion point clouds, but he could also extract vegetation indices like the very well-known normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI, the simple ratio index, etc., etc., green normalized difference vegetation index, from the spectral information of the camera with which he extracted the structure from motion point cloud. And then he derived a bunch of statistics for every plot for which we have yield. The yield was provided by our collaborators at Cornell, and he tried a bunch of different algorithms, from simple stepwise regression to a little bit more complex support vector regression and things like that. The results are good, but I won't say spectacular. Here you can see some of the results with some of the LiDAR-based indices, and you can see they're pretty linear, but highly variable. R-squared, not bad. 60% of the variance in LAI, leaf area index, is explained by this specific metric. But remember, it's only one metric. The RMSE to me is still a little high, it's 22%. You can see the RMSEs roughly hover around that 20% level, so we're not super happy with this result. But we've seen that if you include more indices and metrics, you get a much improved results for LAI assessment. And because Faye is an imaging scientist, he's also really interested in what the collection properties do for our assessment ability. So he evaluated different altitudes. We flew at 28 meters above ground and 51 meters above ground. And he also looked at different cultivars, different bean types. So first off, there's a distinct improvement when flying lower. And that makes sense. You can sort of say, oh, of course there would be, because you get a denser point cloud, you get smaller pixels. But you have to prove it in science. You cannot just say it, right? So when we fly higher, yes, we can fly faster and cover more ground, but we do see a slight deterioration in our modeling ability for different altitudes. In terms of the cultivars, there's a specific cultivar, Flavor Sweet, that has a distinctly higher R-squared than the other cultivars. And we attributed this mainly to the very uniform, dense structure of this cultivar. So it was easier to assess structure for that cultivar, which is another interesting thing to realize when you want to extend your algorithms to industry. Here's just some examples of what I just said. Here are sort of highlighted the stepwise, simple stepwise regression. This is not rocket science. 28-meter altitude flights, and here you see the LAI measured decently accurate. Now I'm explaining 73% of the variability in LAI using a set of metrics. Here I think is roughly 5 or so metrics. So it's quite a few metrics, but you get a decent estimate for leaf error index. In other words, one of the structural metrics we want to use eventually in this year's research to predict disease risk. So I've mentioned most of these conclusions. I think it's very exciting to work with this kind of technology. Everybody is flying drones or are flying drones these days, and it's such interesting technology. It's on a beautiful day like today here in New York. I can for the first time say, let's go collect some LiDAR data and hyperspectral data for a crop. It used to be a huge planning exercise to mobilize airplanes, very costly. A typical hyperspectral collect, if I wanted to fly the research site at Cornell, would cost me at least $20,000 just to get the plane here, collect the data, have the agency process the data and deliver the data to me. Now we can go and fly these data on a whim. So we're getting very good results, I think. It's very promising results, let's say that. But I'm not the person who's convinced that drones will be the solution for everything out there. I'll give you an example. If you want to estimate nitrogen, why would you fly a drone if you know you need, say, 4 wavelengths to estimate nitrogen so that you can determine the fertilizer? I would much rather program those 4 wavelengths that I've identified in a tractor-based camera. John Deere and others are already doing this. But that's, I think, a better use of drone data to identify the wavelengths that we need, that we might program into a camera at the tractor that can feed information to the fertilizer spreader in the back and apply fertilizer differentially based on what the sensor says. Now, if you're talking disease risk, where you want to know tomorrow, what should I fly for disease? Yeah, sure, a drone would be very useful because you can immediately assess structure, you can get spectral information for flowering, where you should spray. Now there I can think a drone would be very useful. And some of you probably know of this kind of research. We're also doing some of this that I didn't mention here, but moisture stress assessment for vineyards. When you grow a vineyard, you really want to manage the irrigation very carefully, because typically, if you stress that vine a little bit, you get a much more flavorful grape and a much better wine that you can make from that grape. If you overwater the vineyard, you get the typical grapes you buy in the grocery store that's nice and juicy and fun to eat. But if you want a flavorful grape for wine making, you want to sort of be very careful of how much irrigation you supply to the vineyard. So we are collaborating with a professor at Cornell as well, Dr. Alan Laxo. He knows vineyards very well. He's built these little tensiometers that you can plant into the cambium of vines and measure the stem water potential, the water stress of the plant. And I said, Alan, but if you can do this, why do you need drones? And he said, these are little expensive sensors. You cannot plant them in every single vine. You can do spot checks. So we still want the drones to fly a vineyard and provide moisture stress maps for the farmer that can then adjust the irrigation to just that level where you get little stressed vines and good grapes. And we use these sensors in the vineyard as calibration checks to make sure that our wall-to-wall image systems models work well. So that's very exciting research ongoing. I love this precision ag research, even as a forester. I sort of think as precision agriculture is my great time, you know, my midlife crisis research, because I'm starting to do more applied research now, which I really enjoy. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll open it up to questions. You'll see my email here. You're welcome to reach out to me. And I want to acknowledge the funding. We've received quite significant funding from National Science Foundation's Partnerships for Innovation program, and also from the United States Department of Agriculture to do this kind of precision ag research. And as I said at the bottom, obviously they asked me to say this, but this is not my opinion or their opinions, it's our opinions, right? They want to be careful that we don't put words in their mouth. But anyway, with that, I'll finish up and I'll open the floor to any questions.
Okay, well, right now we don't have any questions at the moment, but let's wait a few minutes. Well, we have the first one. It's from Vico Rocha. What nature are nanoparticles and how do you spread them through the plant?
So nanoparticles, I'm not the expert here, this is Dr. Abe Struck, but nanoparticles are by its name nano. They're very small particles, but they're engineered particles. They're not necessarily natural. So what he does is at this stage for the research, he pressure injects them in the plant. So he picks a few leaves in the plant and he injects them with pressure into the plant itself. Then the particles move into the cellular structure of the plant, and there they then sit without damaging the plant or inhibiting any photosynthesis. But the neat thing is they reflect, they fluoresce actually. They fluoresce energy, they emit energy that is determined by how water stressed the plant is. I don't know the exact detail of how much or how little they fluoresce, and that's a big question. Can I sense this fluorescence that is driven by moisture stress? Can I sense that from a drone, or do I need closer proximity sensors like on a boom for a pivot spray? And that's still research that is ongoing.
The next one is in cultivar tracking, more precisely, even at the level of a single plant. What are some solutions to improve crops also at the level?
That's a very good question. I think it depends on your application. If you think about plant level management, very few farmers want to manage at the plant. We work with Dr. Corinne Ketterings, again, Cornell. As you can see, Cornell does a lot of very cool agricultural research. RIT has a really good imaging program, so it's a very nice interaction. Dr. Ketterings have spoken to farmers for corn, for instance. You know what they tell her? They don't want more than 4 zones in their fields. They don't want to manage a single corn plant. It's not cost effective. They want 4 zones. They want high yield, low variability, low yield, low variability, and then high yield, high variability, low yield, high variability. So they want to know which zones should they focus on. So some farmers want to manage not at the plant level. Then if you compare a vineyard, if you're growing wine and you're growing that wine on maybe 30 hectares, maybe 40, 50 hectares, small farm, the farmers there literally walk through the vineyard and they look at the cluster of grapes and they say, for argument's sake, every cluster of grapes need 6 leaves to get the optimal sugar content. If they see 7 leaves, they take a scissors and they clip the 7th leaf. That's how specific their management is at the plant level. So I guess that's my answer is some crops will require precision ag at the plant level. Most will require not at the plant level, but maybe at the zone or localized level within a field. I hope that made sense.
Okay, thank you. Those are the questions that we have at the moment. I don't know if you want to wait a few moments.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and I thank you for this opportunity. It's really exciting to see this very exciting program. I see Dr. Amy Tabb is speaking a little later. We've had her here for a visit as well. She does wonderful work in orchards and 3D assessment of orchards. So it's really neat to see her on there as well. It's a very exciting program.
Yes, we're going to have her here. I think at 11 a.m. So it's going to be an interesting talk. Vico Rocha says, does your institution have LIDAR?
Yes, so we have a LiDAR sensor too, actually, that we fly on the drones, but we don't have airborne sensors. What I mean on a plane, they're very expensive, as you probably know. They're 1.2 million and upwards dollars. So the LiDAR sensors we fly are mostly on the drones.
I have another question.
Yeah.
How can we start working with the structure from motion?
That's a good question. So if you're good in coding, you'll see there's some PCL, point cloud library code out there. I believe it's C++, but I assume there's also some Python libraries you can look into. But if you want to work with structure from motion, we use software called Pix4D, literally PIX 4, the number 4D, Pix4D. It's software that allows you to import two images, and if they're overlapping, it finds the tie point between the images, and it gives you a 3D point cloud for every, 3D point for every pixel, every overlapping pixel. I've had students who literally use the drone that they purchased themselves for fun from, here in the United States, Best Buy is one of the technology stores. They purchased the drone from Best Buy, and they fly in Rochester, for instance, in the city that I live, and they use software like that to develop 3D structures. The technology of the algorithms for structure from motion is very old. It's very well established algorithms. If you're a good mathematician and coder, you can probably code it up yourself. It's that established. It comes from forestry too, with a stereoscopic imagery where we used two photos, hard copy photos, not even digital. And if you look at those two photos from using a stereoscope, you literally have sort of a scope that with the one eye you look at the one photo and the other eye you look at the other photo, the trees become 3D. You can see them in 3D. It's beautiful. I know you're a generation who works with or are used to 3D. You see 3D in the movies and so on. So you think, 3D is nothing new. But for me, it was really special as a forestry student to see those 3D trees. But the cool thing is, because these are stereoscopic images, I can use measurements from the center point of the photo to the parallax offset of the bottom of the tree and the top of the tree, and you can easily calculate the height of the tree. So that's the same principle. That's just now the computer vision experts call it structure from motion, but it's photogrammetry. And that's the old school name for it is photogrammetry or stereoscopic imaging. So as a student, I would really encourage you to find some old papers, look at the algorithms, and if you want to buy off-the-shelf software, you can buy something like Pix4D. If you want to use open source software, you can look at Point Cloud Library and so on.
Thank you.
We have another question is, what computing capacity do they have for image analysis?
We found that we don't need a lot these days. Most of our processing happens on standard laptops. Now, they're expensive laptops. They have, say, 32 or 64 gig RAM or so, but nothing too extreme. So for the computing, the biggest issue for me with drones is storage. Because if you go and fly today and you collect, say, I'm just using examples, 5 hectares of 2 centimeter hyperspectral data. Now remember, 2 centimeters, high spatial resolution, and you're collecting as many as 500 spectral channels, color channels. So that drone or that image, and maybe it's a 10 or a 16-bit image, it very quickly becomes a huge image. And now you're flying a second time and a third time to look at changes throughout the day. and suddenly you need a lot of storage. So that's still a very practical problem, is how do we store, retrieve, and process and present drone data? And I think a lot of people are working on what they call the workflows for that, is to be able to fly data today and apply algorithms that you as a scientist have developed, and then apply it to the drone data, and then present the information product to the farmer. Because think about it, the farmer doesn't want the image. Sure, it's nice to look at, but the farmer wants the information product with which he or her can actually make some decisions, irrigation decisions, fertilizer decisions. So I don't know if that quite answered your question, but the computing resource in terms of processing is actually not that bad, but the storage is the big problem, I think. Some of the algorithms, like the new deep learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, they get more computing intensive, where you want maybe graphic cards and so on. You want to make use of graphic processing.
Okay, well, I think those are all the questions that we have.
Good. Well, thank you very much. It was really fun, and I wish you well with your program. It's really exciting.
No, thank you for being here with us.
Mm.